Welcome to the California Association for the Deaf's platform. We are here at our Deaf webinar series. I am Kavita Pipalia. Good evening, folks. This is Dr. Marla Hattrack. I am the chair, the policy committee chair at CAD. So please bear with us. This is Kavita. Okay, the tech team has just checked in with me and let me know that our things are back up and operational. We will resume with the webinar. Thank you. Dr. Carrie Liu speaking. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. I would like to start tonight by presenting you with a little bit of employment data. We know that when it comes to employment, uh, it's not the most important indicator of success for everyone. We can have a vision of what success means that is self-defined, and it's different for each one of us. It could be employment, it could be being a part of a community organization, it could be the activities that we're involved. But for government and federal reporting reasons, the government does look at employment as a measure of success. So typically employment rates are what is tracked. In 2021, many deaf adults did not have a job and were not employed. Many deaf adults were also looking for employment and looking for jobs. Many more are also not engaged in the job search, meaning perhaps they're busy with academics. Maybe they're busy with family responsibilities and so on. This number gives us an indication of employment gaps between deaf and hearing people within the states, as there are disparities. The question you see on the slide is what we're going to discuss. There is an employment gap that exists, but the question is really, how do we change that? How do we make sure that the deaf community can reach their goals? One thing that we see frequently in our data analysis over the years, and that is that something that definitely makes a difference in employment is education. If a deaf student completes high school and continues on to post-secondary academics, then they have better employment rates. There is an employment gap between hearing and deaf people, and that shrinks with the more education and the more training a deaf student receives. Any type of education has its merits. They could be classes at community college. Those would increase employment outcomes for deaf students. Also, when we look at education after high school, attending college, getting a BA degree, a bachelor's degree, maybe even grad school, we see that deaf earnings also increase, or earnings by deaf individuals also increase. If deaf and hearing individuals have a similar education level, they also will have a similar earnings rate. This is part of the reason why NDC does the work that we do. We aim to make sure that all educational environments, whether they be college or training programs, are accessible for deaf students and deaf youth, deaf adults, and that deaf individuals have more opportunities to be more competitive in the workplace. Now, I did use the word competition. Why did I mention that? We know as deaf people that we apply for a job there, and there might be a hearing person with the same educational level who's applying for the same job. We know that we can't be the same. We have to be more competitive to achieve that job, which is why education might be more critical for deaf people than they are for hearing people, because it's what we can use to recommend us. It's the tools that we can use to build our abilities up. And education will build up the tools and knowledge that you have so that you could show and display to an employer why you are the better, more qualified, and more educated choice. I'd like to talk a little bit now about education pathways, as in when one is done with high school, the route that is taken to employment. That's an education pathway. There are gaps in the system and there are barriers within the system. And we see systemic barriers already at the high school level. Deaf and hearing graduation numbers have a disparity, and that exists already, which is concerning because a high school has quite a few different systems, has legal mandates to comply with. So deaf students should be graduating at comparable rates than hearing students, but we see that there's a disparity. That indicates to us that already deaf students are not graduating high school for a variety of reasons. So there are already gaps, there are already systemic barriers that we see at the high school level, and those continue to have an impact, a compounding impact beyond high school. This graphic you see on the slide shows us the pathway. So when we take a look at high school level to bachelor's degree to employment, we see the gaps, we see the disparities across each and every level on the path to employment. High school begins with a 5% deficit. 5% fewer deaf people complete high school than hearing people. That impacts the number of college entry students, which also impacts further on those deaf people who complete a BA degree, which of course would impact the numbers of employment. You can also, by looking at the trajectory, it allows us to understand how the system operates, how the impacts at the high school level have long-term impacts throughout the career pathway, that education and training component along the way. The question that we've talked about within our team at NDC and within the deaf community, we have conversations about it, but it doesn't seem like anything's changed, right? We do see more deaf people in leadership positions. We do see more deaf people in movies and media, actors, actresses. We are seeing much more visibility of the deaf community than we have in the past. So we must be thinking things are getting better, right? Well, when you take a look at national level data, that really indicates to us whether or not things have improved over time. Next slide. We're looking at data from 2008 to 2021. In looking at that data, we see high school completion rates. The number has gone up for high school completion rates. In 2008, only 80% of deaf students were graduating high school. In 2021, we see the number is bumped up by 5% to 85.1%. When we took a look at BA completion rates, we see that in 2008, it was almost at 16%. And in 2021, we see that that number jumped to 21%. So we do see that there are improvements in high school completion and BA completion rates. Now, despite those gains, excuse the interpreter, those gains are tracking along the same rates as those hearing rates. But keep in mind, the gap exists already, and the gap continues over time. So yes, there are increases in completion rates, but it's not enough to close the gap on employment. We still have a way to go before we reach equity when it comes to employment. Employment outcomes are still impacted. The next slide will illustrate this when it comes to the employment gap. You see that the numbers there show that the employment has not increased, it's actually decreased from 2008 to 2021. And we understand that employment numbers change drastically throughout the years due to economic forces or other forces. And this is just a comparison between 2 years, 2008 and 2021. You can see that there's a slight decrease, and I think it's an indicator of systemic issues, and it shows that we aren't doing enough. to make changes that impact deaf people's lives in our country. Enough has not been done. We see that education completion rates and BEA completion rates have increased over time. But when we look closer at the data, we see that those increases and changes aren't happening for everyone within the deaf community. If we look at subsets of the deaf community, if we look at BIPOC communities, if we look at Indigenous deaf women communities, if we look at different specific groups and their educational attainment levels, we see that the numbers are different for them. There's differences for people who are deaf, deaf blind, deaf and BIPOC, deaf and disabled. So there is a long way to go before we reach equity for everyone within the diverse deaf community that exists. I also want to share a few data points. Now, these data points aren't an all-inclusive data set that captures everything, but it does help us identify systemic barriers and their impacts, their disparate impacts on deaf blind people, deaf people with disabilities, deaf Black people, and Latinx deaf people. As we can see, 85% of deaf people complete high school. That number drops marginally to 81% for Black deaf people. We see it drops to 79% for Asian deaf people and 77% for deaf blind people and down to 72% for Latinx deaf people. So this tells us that there is a layer of barriers still inherent and embedded within the system. Next slide. We just covered high school completion rates. And we saw that there's differences within the deaf community on high school completion rates, depending on race, class, gender, disability, and so on. Now, when we take a look at deaf people completing BA degrees, we've got something similar. 20% of deaf people complete a BA. That number continues to drop when it comes to Black deaf people, Latinx deaf people, deaf disabled people, Native American deaf people. And also keep in mind, when we talk about the data emphasizes or highlights and shows us systemic problems. The data is not showing us problems with individuals, with deaf people. The data is showing us that the system, there are systemic barriers. We need to make changes to the system. We need to change the system, not people. This is what the data is telling us. I just shared a variety of data points. I'd like to tell you that the data points are all available at the NDC website. You can see the website on the slide, which is www.nationaldeafcenter.org/dashboard. This dashboard on the screen was recently developed and just released. The statistics are pulled from the US Census. The US Census has an earnings portion that is responded to by 40,000 deaf individuals. And so we're able to pull the data for our website from that report, which makes the data more easily accessible for you. If you'd like to break it down by specific groups, if you'd like to break it down by outcomes, like for example, associate degree completion, BA degree completion, and if you want to break it down and see the experience for Black deaf women, the dashboard allows you to select these different classifications and then generate a report, which you can then download. And you can use those statistics to evidence or justify any policy changes. And we really recommend and encourage folks in the community to use our dashboard for those reasons. The dashboard also includes state level data. So it has national level data, which you can compare with states individually. So you can look at the nation versus California. You can look at California versus other states to get a better understanding of those systemic issues. And we want the dashboard to become a tool that you can use to identify issues in your state so that you can improve and reduce those systemic barriers, which should have an impact on college outcomes, high school outcomes. And so if you'd like that information, take a look at the dashboard. I have a screenshot on the slide up, but feel free to visit our website and play with the data and play with the numbers. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and challenge you with the question. This comes up quite often in conversations that we have about employment and so on and so on. Commonly said is, well, Social Security income's got to be part of the problem, and deaf people that are on Social Security income are a problem. I ask you to be cautious with that, and I want to challenge you with that notion. Where does that notion come from? A lot of times when I present, I like to ask folks to guess what is the number of deaf individuals on Social Security income. I will ask you in the audience, I can't see your responses, but I want you to think about it and guess how many people as a percentage in our country are on Social Security income. A lot of the times I get a response of 40%, 50%, 60%. I tend to get a really high number when I ask that question. On this slide is the actual number. Only 11.5% of deaf individuals throughout the United States receive Social Security benefits. Now, I do recognize this does not capture SSDI benefits, which are different than SSI benefits, but the number does change slightly, not by an astronomical degree, but the emphasis that deaf people are not working because they're on Social Security. That is not the reason. And I just want to emphasize and highlight those numbers. Next. As I mentioned earlier, the data shows us that the problem lies within the system, not within deaf people. The data tells us what arises, what shows up. The CAD webinar series that have been hosted cover the lifespan of a deaf individual from birth all the way through life, and we cover the educational experience. So we do see barriers and have identified barriers at birth. Gaps exist, which indicates that the system is not designed for deaf individuals to thrive. The data is showing us the outcomes, it's showing us what happens. The data is not showing us what deaf people are capable of doing. The data is showing us that the system has barriers and that the system needs to be improved. That is the key here. And we are looking at data from 2008. And it shows to us that we have a long way to go to really see some impactful changes. Of course, the work we've been doing seems to be business as usual, which might not be achieving the results we want. I would like to ask the community, including myself, including CAD, how we can all come together to take a systems approach to this issue to make sure that we change the system versus trying to fix a single problem here or there or applying band-aid solutions. We need to think holistically about the entire system and make those changes so that deaf learners and deaf students can achieve their goals. And that is the work we are doing now. I'll give you just a second to read through the slide. I'd like to reemphasize again, the discussion is about the problem within the system, not the problem with deaf people. And when we look at the research, we see that deaf young people and their beliefs about themselves and the way they see themselves in the future and who they see themselves being in life, deaf youth are have very clearly defined goals for their future. And deaf youth who have self-determination indicate that they are confident in what they want out of life and that they can make decisions for themselves and that they're ready. Uh, Deaf young people today have a strong sense of what they want their future to be. They have a strong sense that they will complete their degrees. So this shows again that the issue is not with deaf individuals. They have the goals and the aims, but it's the system that is creating the barriers to those successes. And I'll give you a minute to read through this slide as well. I want to share one example. This study was run a few years ago, and we identified that deaf youth with a stronger sense of autonomy during high school, they were more likely to be promoted at work if they had that strong sense of autonomy younger. And they also were more likely to have increased earnings. One example that that study identified is that young deaf people who look for a job on their own and do not rely on anyone else to find employment for them, later on in life, they move on more at work and are more promoted and have higher rates of earnings. And so I want to encourage everyone here that with our own children, our own deaf youth, and your families, student teachers, anyone that interacts with the deaf student, we really need to provide that motivation and that encouragement and tell them that they can be what they would like to achieve. We need to create a culture where they decide for themselves, think for themselves, and they will make mistakes. We have to allow room for one. But that's not always happening with deaf youth throughout the states. And the research shows us that deaf youth with a stronger sense of autonomy will be carried much further in life than those that do not have that. So this reflects to us again that the system has barriers to deaf youth where it burdens their sense of autonomy. Another thing I want to discuss when it comes to systemic issues or systemic burdens, when deaf people have to navigate or confront a system, they will interact with different adults within their lives, families, teachers, counselors, coaches. There's a whole gamut, audiologists, there's a whole gamut of adults in a deaf youth's lives. When those adults believe that these deaf youth can succeed, which is an important question that we need to ask ourselves, in the deaf community, we know that. We know that when we look back, there have been many folks who have believed in us, right? And some who haven't. And that is part of the problem because a lot of the research shows that expectations from adults have an impact on a deaf youth's motivation levels to achieve those outcomes or not. There are quite a bit of items involved in a deaf youth's life that will help them achieve success at high school. And some of those are like, of course, their grades, their homework, work experience, and so on. So there are several factors that are determinants. One of the strongest factors was that if their parents have expectations and believe that their deaf youth would be employed or would go to college, then that deaf youth does follow through with that, which shows us that what we believe matters. We need to believe that deaf youth can achieve their success, and they will. This is a question again that I will leave with you. How can we help foster and encourage that sense where we strengthen deaf youth so that they can achieve success. The data, again, which we've talked about all night, the data shows us the problem. The question becomes, how do we solve the problem? Well, when we're looking into the system, we have to look at how the systems run, where the barriers are. We all have a role, whether small or large, within the system. So it's critical that we take a look at our own role and how we can contribute to improve the system, how we can push for change, how we can engage and have those conversations for improvements. This is a responsibility for us all, for the community. We need to come together and figure out how to change and improve the system. We need to make sure that deaf youth can achieve their goals, that they can arrive at those dreams. We know that the process of exiting high school and entering college or a training program or employment, that's already a difficult transition for anyone. Never mind being a deaf youth. All of our lives is hard. When we were a teenager, I'm sure we had the question, what am I going to do in life? Boy, it's tough out here. Now add to that or compound that with systemic issues or systemic barriers. That's what creates the assumption in people that deaf students cannot succeed. But that is not the case. What we have to look at is that pathway, the transition process from high school to employment to college to post-secondary education. We need to look at that pathway carefully and all components of it and see how we can improve it. This is all our responsibility, the community's responsibility. It's not the responsibility of deaf youth. Changing the system is not their onus, but it is our onus, the community's onus. With that said, I'd like to thank you for allowing me to speak tonight, to present the data, to show you some numbers, to present some food for thought. I enjoyed showing you the data dashboard on our website. And I encourage you to reach out to us if you want more information on post-secondary education, completion rates, and all the other statistics that you saw. Then reach out to us at the National Deaf Center. Thank you. Dr. Marla Hattrack speaking. Nice presentation, Dr. Carrie Liu. I know that the data is critical for us to continue our dialogue. I do have a couple questions ready for you tonight. The numbers, statistics speak for themselves. People love talking about data before making systemic change, and I'm sure you know that. So very nice that you had that data with you. So the first question for you tonight, Dr. Carrie Liu Bloom, is what would be some of the reasons why deaf students do not complete high school? Dr. Carrie Liu Bloom speaking. That is a great question. We don't have specific data to show, and the reason for that is from what we've seen, vague information exists, but this points again to a systemic gap. There are many deaf education programs throughout the United States and school districts that serve deaf students as well. Many of the state leaders and administrators indicate to us that deaf students are isolated in different pockets of the state, so it becomes challenging to make sure that they have the right and appropriate resources. For example, deaf students should have access to voc rehab during high school. They should. That's not always the case. It's not happening everywhere. If deaf students have access to resources, help, therapy, vocational rehabilitation, right? If it becomes challenging, then they could decide to drop out of school without those resources in place. So we are encouraging states throughout the country to check into their outreach efforts to make sure that each deaf high school student is aware of resources available in their area, because that is not always happening. Dr. Marla Hattrack speaking. This is one good example of why deaf students do not graduate in high school. You mentioned they're isolated in different pockets of the state. Why haven't we fixed that? Why aren't we moving forward with legislative action, which are demanding these deaf students to be brought together? And you are aware of it, Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom, but we don't see any activity on the state level for that. Would you agree with that? This is Dr. Bloom. I believe that to be a challenging question, because we know that many families want their deaf child at home with them. They want to keep them in the local school district. The priority for me is to make sure that each school knows where to find the resources. They might not need to have the resources at their school, but they need to know where to find the deaf program, where to find the resources that will serve the student. We need to see a cross-sharing of resources that isn't happening currently, right? Of course, we would like to run with the resources that exist at a school, but that's not the way it works with the deaf population. There's already a lack or shortage of professionals that are familiar on working with deaf students and their needs. There is not enough qualified assessors. There's not enough qualified therapists. There's not enough proficient educators and teachers. We are already faced with these issues. Now these students are isolated, and those professionals in those areas are working at a bare minimum with what they have. So we're encouraging states to do more cross efforts where there's more outreach, so that there is more awareness of resources. Dr. Marla Hattrack, so do you get a sense that this could be a possibility, that those connections to resources could be made? Dr. Bloom responds, yes. Dr. Marla Hattrack, second question is, what are the systemic barriers to deaf people completing BAs? So why aren't they finishing college? Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom, that again is a great question. We see a lot of barriers on a daily basis at the work we do at National Deaf Center. We have a help team. The help team receives many emails. They field many phone calls from colleges in the United States throughout the country, and they also receive contact from deaf students, typically about barriers. Access most commonly is indicated to be not the best. Another issue is unqualified interpreters, or just a lack of interpreters. There are many colleges in the United States that just cannot find interpreters. Or sometimes a class is in place, the student will show up and they just can't find the interpreter. The interpreters are nowhere to be found. This is something that is happening throughout the states. Also, many colleges don't have the resources to make sure that the entire campus is accessible. They might provide a classroom interpreter, which is fine, but then nothing when it comes to extracurricular activities. They might not have a way to socialize and interact with other classmates on the campus. Other experiences outside of the classroom then are not accessible, which means that a deaf student has to fight harder to have access to all those other activities. So it's actually the entire college experience that is still challenging in many ways to deaf college students. Dr. Marla Hattrack, yeah, after having a deal with a couple hurdles, one can get frustrated and quit, right? That's kind of what you're seeing happening. And this is Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom. Yes, in a nutshell. Dr. Hattrack, do, do you believe that we can attain equity? And if so, how? Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom, that's $1 million question. But I do believe that we can achieve it. That is the focus of the work we do. We have to believe that we can achieve it. We just have to. What equity will look like, I think, requires a deeper commitment than what we currently see. It requires many more players at the table, in the room. It's not a fight for only the deaf community to fight. It's a fight for everyone to fight, for everyone to be involved. When we work with colleges and universities, we tell them, you can't fix this issue only with the Disability Services Office. You need an entire commitment from the entire campus. And so if the question is, what would the whole state look like if the state were committed to equity? Right? We might not know, but it's important to ask that question. This is Dr. Hattrack. Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom, we could have a whole nother webinar just on that subject. We sure could. The next question says, in California, we figured that impoverished language access might be one of the causal variables to systemic barriers. 75% of students would like to go to college, but only a small fraction of them graduated college. Do you think that is tied into language skills? Is it social-emotional? Is it cognitive? What are the factors that could really explain any of those? Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom. We know that an education is a foundation for, excuse the interpreter, language is the foundation for many other skills. And of course, there is a relationship. That relationship, however, is not clearly defined, but language is definitely part of the equation. Language provides us access to information, to social networks, to resources, and so on. But I do want to mention that we want to be cautious when we talk about language. I don't want us to focus too much on English skills and make that be the blame on why deaf youth don't succeed in college. We see that come up quite often, where a deaf student has a struggle in college due to a lack of English skills, and then that becomes the blame. That's not where we want the focus to be. I ran a study a few years ago where I wanted to challenge that convention and that assumption. What we looked at is we looked at students during high school, and we looked at their standard assessment of English that they had, their English metrics in high school. And then we compared it to 10 years later, whether it was employment or college that was impacted, and if there was a difference due to it. What we found is that there was no impacts. So a deaf student, high school English assessment scores did not have an impact on employment outcome or educational attainment outcomes. People who had marginal English still were able to have great earnings or able to attend colleges. And those of us that are part of the deaf community, we're already aware of that. We already know that there are many competent deaf people employed in a lot of areas, and we understand as a community that it's a misconception. It's more than needing English. It's a systemic issue. We need to make sure that deaf people have access to information, communication, social opportunities. It's a whole scope of life that needs to be accessed. It's not just about access to English. Dr. Hattrack, very valid point, Dr. Bloom. The next question asks, how can we ensure that our high school students have the support to complete high school? And I think you touched upon that just slightly, but the question is still in the queue. Dr. Bloom, of course. What we do when we work with school districts, state special ed leadership, we try to encourage them to build better cohesive relationships with their local resources and to leverage those, because many locations have resources in place. There is a vocational rehab office nearby. There is a community-based organization providing supports nearby. The issue is the deaf high school students aren't aware of the resources. That's where the failure is. And then the question is, why should we put the burden on a single high school to meet all the needs that a deaf student has? That's not fair. Deaf individuals, just like anyone else, needs a community to thrive. We need each other. So high schools and educational programs need to do some research and do some outreach with the Voc Rehab Office, with any community support programs. Need to be reaching out to those programs, and those programs need to be reaching out to the high school, and we need to be more dependent on each other in that way. Dr. Marla Hattrack says, this is a great discussion. Are there any upcoming policies or items in legislation that we should be aware of to cast a vote for? Dr. Bloom speaking, that's not my area of expertise. We are operating under a federal grant, and because of that, we cannot advocate for a specific policy or legislation. But what we can do is provide the community the resources and the tools to drive policy change and legislation. That's one of the reasons we built this dashboard, because quite often community members, advocacy organizations need to justify and validate the need that exists. That's where a data dashboard comes in. The data dashboard will reflect the gaps and the disparities and the impacts to certain communities versus others. And so that gives you the data to be able to have those conversations. So we are providing the tools for the community to have the discussions. Dr. Hattrack says, yeah, I'm very impressed with the numbers, the statistics, and how you put things together at your website is very, very intuitive, very easy to find the data that one is looking for. Thank you, says Dr. Bloom. Dr. Hattrack, I just want to check in on time. It looks like we have enough time. We will continue with tonight. And the next question is, do you collect any data on deaf-owned businesses? I notice that more and more deaf people are developing their own businesses now. Dr. Bloom says, that is a great question and something that I love to talk about. When we do look at the data for specific types of job experience by deaf people, we're trying to look to better understand not just jobs, but the quality of the employment. We want to make sure that people that are employed feel that it's a sustainable career with opportunities for advancement and earnings, not just a box to be marked that says, yeah, this person got a job. We are looking at things closer, and something that we've identified is that there's a higher percentage of deaf people who own businesses than hearing people. Wow, says Dr. Hattrack. And this is Dr. Bloom. There are more deaf people working for themselves than hearing people are. And what that indicates to us is that deaf people see the barriers within the system and move on to do something on their own for themselves and are self-employed. Dr. Hattrack, I'm getting another question that just came in. And that question says, this seems an interesting topic to discuss. I am concerned about special education. More and more students are going to mainstream schools. Will this be considered a successful outcome, educational outcome? If this is considered success, then what is the data outcome? We need to kill special education. Not my word, somebody else's. And this is Dr. Bloom. I just want to validate that people have a strong feeling when it comes to education, and those feelings are valid. At National Deaf Center, we don't have data on where deaf students are located. But what we do want to generate is the opportunity for deaf people to be able to thrive, which means that we want access to information that is in the community, resources, and so on. Now, where those happen can be in different places. It could be happening at a public school with a huge program with great community resources that has access and to services and peers. Some schools have that. some don't. Some deaf programs, some deaf schools are minimal with not many resources. Other programs are huge with lots of resources. So I want to make sure that we're not separating and causing divisions. There are programs all around that are successful. Our belief is that success can be achieved anywhere in any program with community involvement, with resources being clearly available and accessible, then any deaf person can achieve success. And that's what we encourage. This is Dr. Hattrick. I don't have any more questions unless, oh, I'm being told there might be another question. While we wait for the next question to come up, Dr. Bloom, and this is Dr. Hattrick, your emphasis on connection to resources is key. Sometimes I tell myself, okay, the resources exist and we have more and more, but having resources won't change the landscape. My kids often tell me something like, I tell my kids I'm looking for something and they say, Mom, Google it. So I have thought and asked myself, why don't other folks use Google more often to find resources? Dr. Carrie Lou Bloom, when we use the word resource, I am coming from a perspective where I'm thinking about people, individuals, community, not just resources online. Those are critical and important, but we don't want to put too much weight into information. I think sometimes the information can be overload, where there's too much information. And what we need are more relationships with people, those types of resources where organizations, advocacy services come together, especially when they exist. And we need to build in some outreach so that those relationships can be developed. For example, there might be a school that is unaware that the community is full of deaf individuals and they're operating on their own without knowing what resources exist. And they don't have to reinvent the wheel. All they have to do is develop a relationship with resources. Dr. Hattrick, yes, clearly, Dr. Bloom. Okay, I've got the next question in, and that question says, as a parent role, do you think parents are responsible for educating their children to reach their dreams and goals? Dr. Bloom, in my presentation, I did emphasize that parent expectations are critical. Parents' number one job is to believe that their deaf child can. That's their job. Parents, believe in your deaf child. That will carry them. I did a study a couple years ago looking at two different factors in terms of family support. One was having a belief, meaning that parents believed their children would go to college, get a job, live independently. There was a group that had beliefs. And then there was another group that were active, that helped with homework, that went to the IEP, that were involved. And we took a look at both groups, and we found that those parents that attended the IEP, that helped with their homework, that didn't make much of an impact over the long term. However, the group of parents that believed that their deaf child would succeed, that carried that student and stayed over a longer term, which gave them longer momentum, which actually took them to those goals that they had. Now, I'm not saying parents should stop helping their deaf child with their homework. That's also important. But what I am saying is the weight of our beliefs is far deeper than the weight of what we do. Dr. Hattrick, when it comes to beliefs, it comes across in every aspect that you interact with your deaf child with. So yeah, that is parent reinforcement. And I believe we don't have any more questions at this point. We are done with questions. Dr. Carrie Lou, thank you so much. What a good session we had tonight. Thank you for responding to all our questions with a cheery, bright smile. Thank you so much. This is Dr. Bloom. Yes, thank you. I enjoyed being here tonight as well. Dr. Hattrick, yes, thank you for coming. And I have to remember, you're in Texas. It might be your bedtime right now. This is Dr. Bloom. It is a little late. Dr. Hattrack, yes. And I'd like to remind folks that next month we are having Noel King as a presenter on mental health. Why is it important? So, folks, we will see you next month. With that said, thank you and all have a good night. And Dr. Bloom says, thank you all. Good night.